Good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday, and we are back reading The Nutcracker by E.T.A. Hoffman. There's our picture of the cover there. And we are on chapter 7, which is called The Story of the Hard Nut today. If you'll remember last time when we were listening, Drosselmeyer asked Marie if she had ever heard the story of Princess Pirlipat, the witch Dame Mouserinks, and the clever Clockmaker. She said she hadn't, and so he is going to be telling the story as follows. And we will read most of chapter 7 today and finish it tomorrow. Okay, the story of the hard nut. Pirlipat's mother was a king's wife, which meant that she was a queen. Pirlipat herself became a princess the moment she was born. The king was quite beside himself with joy over the birth of his beautiful little daughter. As she lay in her cradle, he danced gleefully about on one leg, shouting out again and again, "Hip, hurrah, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah! Did anybody ever see anything so lovely as my Pirlipat?" All of the ministers of state, as well as the generals, the presidents, and the officers of the staff, danced about on one leg as the king did. They cried out in response, "No, no, never." Indeed, there was no denying that since the world began, there had never been a lovelier baby than Princess Pirlipat. Her little face looked as if it had been woven out of the most delicate white and rose-colored silk. Her eyes were of sparkling azure, and her hair resembled curling threads of gold. Moreover, she had come into the world with 2 rows of little pearly teeth, with which, 2 hours after her birth, she bit the Lord High Chancellor, making him shout, "Oh, Gemini!" quite loudly. Fierce as this bite was, it pleased the people of the kingdom, who felt that it showed great intelligence and discrimination on the part of the angelical little baby. All was joy and gladness except for one thing. The queen was very anxious and uneasy, though nobody could say why. She insisted that Pirlipat's cradle be very carefully guarded. Not only did she keep soldiers at the nursery doors, but she also stationed 2 head nurses next to the cradle, with 6 other nurses posted around the room at night. But what seemed strangest of all was that these nurses were required to have cats on their laps and to pet them all night long so that they would never stop purring. Dear reader, now let me explain how all these strange precautions came about. Once upon a time, many powerful kings and princes assembled at the court of Pirlipat's father. To entertain these great nobles, tournaments, plays, and formal balls were held on the grandest scale. The king, who wished to exhibit his great wealth, made up his mind that once he would draw even more deeply from the royal treasury. To impress his guests to the utmost, he decided to give a grand sausage banquet. After having checked both with the cookmaster and the court astronomer to find an hour appropriate for pork butchering, he jumped into a state carriage and personally invited all the kings and princes to a meal. He told them that the menu would consist solely of soup, because he wanted to surprise them with the magnificence of his sausages. Upon his return to the palace, he said to the queen, very graciously, "My darling, only you know exactly how I like my sausages." The queen understood that this meant that she would have to make the sausages herself. She promptly ordered the chancellor of the treasury to take the great golden sausage kettle and the silver casserole dishes out of storage. An enormous fire was kindled out of sandalwood. The queen put on her damask kitchen apron, and, with the help of a few ladies-in-waiting, a delicious aroma of broth was soon steaming out of the kettle. This tantalizing smell penetrated into the state council chamber. The king could not control himself. "Excuse me for a few minutes, my lords and gentlemen," he said. He rushed into the kitchen, embraced the queen, stirred the kettle with his own golden scepter, and then returned to the council chamber with a peaceful mind. Now the crucial moment arrived for cutting the fat into pieces and browning it on silver spits. The ladies-in-waiting retired because the queen, out of love and respect for her loyal husband, wanted to do the rest of the work herself. While she was working alone, the queen suddenly heard, as the fat began to brown, a delicate whispering voice that was saying, "Psst, sister, give me some of that. I'm a queen just like you." The queen knew well who was speaking. It was the witch Dame Mouserinks, who had resided in the palace for many years. She was queen of the realm of Mausoleum, and she lived with a considerable court of her own under the kitchen hearth. She even claimed to be related to the royal family of the king and queen. Pirlipat's mother was a kind-hearted woman, though she didn't care to recognize Dame Mouserinks as a relative. She was willing, as at this festive season, to spare the tidbits that Dame Mouserinks requested. So she said, "Come out, then, Dame Mouserinks. Of course you can taste my browned fat." Dame Mouserinks came running out as fast as she could, held up her dainty little paws, and took one morsel of fat after another as quickly as the queen held them out. The queen's charity couldn't stop there. Soon all Dame Mouserinks' uncles and cousins and aunts scurried into the kitchen, as did her 7 sons, all dull-witted rascals. They all demanded their share of browned fat, and the queen was too frightened to refuse them. Luckily, the head lady-in-waiting came in, and she drove the demanding visitors away. Thus, a little of the browned fat was left over. Filled with worry, the queen called in the court mathematician, who skillfully devised a formula by which the remaining fat could be evenly distributed among all the remaining sausages. The next evening, kettledrums and trumpets summoned the foreign princes and rulers to the feast. They arrived wearing their robes of state, some of them on white palfreys, some in coaches made of glass. The king received them with much gracious ceremony and took his seat at the head of the table, with his crown on his head and his scepter in his hand. But as the liverwurst sausage course was being served, some guests observed that the king was turning pale and raising his eyes to heaven. His bosom was heaving in terrific sighs, and it was clear that some terrible pain was assaulting his insides. When the blood sausages were handed around, he fell back in his seat, covered his face with his hands, and loudly wailed and groaned. The guests all sprang from the table, and the court physician groped desperately for the unlikely ruler's pulse. A nameless sorrow seemed to be weighing on him. At last, after the doctor had tried every remedy he could think of, burning feathers under the king's nose and so on, the royal patient seemed to come around a bit. He stammered, barely audibly, the words, "Too little fat." The queen threw herself at his feet in despair and cried in a voice broken by sobs, "Oh, my poor unhappy royal husband, what pain you must be feeling. See the guilty one here at your feet. Dame Mouserinks and all her family, they came and gobbled up the fat, and," with these words, the queen fainted. Oh my goodness. Here's a picture of the queen fainting as the others sitting here at the table. Oh, there she is, right here. And the sausages on their plates. Silly story. Let's see. The king jumped up, full of fury, and cried in a terrible voice, "Lady, what is the meaning of this?" The head lady in waiting told all she knew, and the king swore to take revenge on Dame Mouserinks and her family for devouring the fat that was meant for the sausages. The Privy Council was summoned, and it proclaimed that Dame Mouserinks should be put on trial and that all her property should be seized. To prevent her from eating any more of the fat that rightfully belonged to him, the king called in the court Clockmaker, whose name was the same as mine, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer. The Clockmaker promised that he would rid the palace of Dame Mouserinks and her family once and for all, by means of crafty diplomacy. He invented very small and clever mousetrap chambers, into which pieces of browned fat were inserted. He placed these chambers all around the home of Dame Fat Gobbler, as Mouserinks was now known. Fat Gobbler. Mouserinks herself was much too smart not to see through Drosselmeyer's scheme, but her efforts to warn her relatives of the danger were useless. Lured by the tantalizing smell of the fat, all 7 of her sons and great many of her uncles, cousins, and aunts walked into Drosselmeyer's little chambers and were immediately taken prisoners by the fall of a small gate. Once trapped, they were carried to the kitchen to meet their shameful fate. With the small remaining portion of her entourage, Dame Mouserinks fled the scene of horror. Sorrow and rage filled her. The court rejoiced greatly, though the queen was worried. She knew Dame Mouserinks all too well, and understood that the Mouse Queen, with her powers of witchcraft, would never allow the death of her sons or other relatives to go unavenged. I'm going to show you a picture of the mice in the traps. You see him putting the traps under the floor where all the mice lived. One day, while the queen was cooking fricasseed sheep's lungs for the king, a dish he especially enjoyed. Dame Mouserinks suddenly appeared and said, "My sons and my uncles, my cousins and my aunts are now no more. Be careful, lady, or the queen of the mice will bite your little princess in two." With these words, she vanished. The queen was so frightened that she dropped the fricassee into the fire. This was now the second time that Dame Mouserinks had spoiled one of the king's favorite dishes, which made him even angrier. But that's enough for tonight, children. The rest will wait for later. No matter how earnestly Marie begged Grandfather Drosselmeyer to go on with the story, he wouldn't. He jumped up, saying, "Too much at a time wouldn't be good for you. You'll get the rest tomorrow." Marie had her own ideas about the story, but she understood that she would have to wait. Just as the clockmaker was crossing over the threshold, Fritz shouted, "Tell us, Godfather Drosselmeyer, was it really you who invented the mousetraps?" "How could you ask such silly questions?" cried his mother. Drosselmeyer laughed oddly and said, "Well, don't you think I'm a good clockmaker? And shouldn't a good clockmaker know how to make a good mousetrap?" Now, the next section we will continue to read. We have a few more pages left. This is the continuation of the story of the hard nut. "Now you understand, children," said Godfather Drosselmeyer the next evening, "why it was that the queen took such measures to guard her precious little Pirlipat. She was constantly afraid that Dame Mouserinks would come back and carry out her threat to bite the princess to death." Do you remember what she had put in place? So all of these ladies and nurses, why did they have to have those cats sitting on their laps? You see how they all are holding a cat? Because what she was protecting the princess from was mice, right? So all the cats were there so they could catch mice if they needed to. Now remember, Drosselmeyer's ingenious mousetraps were of no use against the clever and cunning Dame Mouserinks. The court astrologer determined that only the cat Purr family had the power to keep her away. This explains why each of the nurses had to keep a descendant of that family, all of whom had been given the honorary rank and title of privy councillors, on her lap, and to keep him awake through the dark hours by gently scratching his back. One night, just after midnight, one of the chief nurses, stationed close to the cradle, woke from a deep nap. Everything around her lay imprisoned in sleep. No purring, just a deep, death-like silence that made a beetle scrabbling inside the wall sound quite loud. Suddenly, this head nurse saw right before her eyes a huge, hideous mouse standing on its hind legs with its head laid on the face of the tiny princess. The head nurse sprang up, screaming in horror. Everybody woke up at the shriek, but Dame Mouserinks, for she was the great big mouse in Pirlipat's cradle, ran quickly away to the corner of the room. The privy councillors dashed after her, the cats, that is, but too late. She was off and away through a chink in the floor. The noise awoke Pirlipat, and she gave a miserable wail. "Heaven be thanked," cried all the nurses. "She's alive." Imagine their grief, however, when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what the beautiful, delicate little thing had become. An enormous, bloated head, instead of the pretty little golden-haired one, sat at the top of a shrunken, crumpled-up body. Green, lifeless eyes stared out where the lovely azure blue pair had been, while her mouth had stretched from one ear to the other. Of course, the queen nearly died of weeping and lamentation. The walls of the king's study had to be hung with padded tapestries because he kept banging his head against them, shouting, "Oh, what a miserable king I am! What a miserable king!" Naturally, this should have been the moment for him to decide that it would be much better to eat his sausages with no fat in them, and to let Dame Mouserinks and her subjects remain peaceably under the hearthstone. But Pirlipat's royal father didn't think of it. What he did was to lay all the blame on the court clockmaker, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg, which is why the king drafted a decree stating that within the space of 4 weeks, Drosselmeyer had to restore Princess Pirlipat to her original condition, or at least to describe a sure way of doing so, or else suffer a shameful death by executioner's axe. Drosselmeyer was more than a little alarmed, yet he retained confidence in his art and in his luck. So he tried the first operation that seemed promising to him. He took Princess Pirlipat very carefully apart, screwed off her hands and feet, and examined her interior structure. Unfortunately, he found that as she grew bigger, she would also grow more deformed. He reassembled her carefully and then sank down beside her cradle, which he wasn't allowed to leave anyway, deeply depressed. This is a very strange story. I don't think you can unscrew her hands and feet, can you? He reassembled her. At last, the 4th week arrived. On the Wednesday of that week, the king came in with his eyes gleaming with anger, waved his scepter about, and cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, heal the princess or prepare to die." Drosselmeyer began to weep bitterly, while little Princess Pirlipat kept herself happy by cracking nuts. For the first time, the clockmaker was struck by Pirlipat's remarkable appetite for nuts, and by the unusual fact that she had come into the world with her teeth already in place. He remembered that, immediately after her transformation by the bite of Dame Mouserinks, she had gone on crying until, by chance, she was given a nut. She had immediately cracked it open and eaten the kernel, then became quite peaceful. From that moment on, her attendants were never able to bring enough nuts to satisfy her. "Oh, holy instinct of nature," cried Drosselmeyer, "you are the force that relates all life, and now you have opened the door of this mystery for me." At once he begged for permission to speak with the court astrologer, who was led to him, closely guarded. The two men embraced each other in tears, for they were close friends. After a moment, they withdrew into a private office where they leafed through many books about instinct, sympathy, antipathy, and other mysterious subjects. Night fell, and the court astrologer consulted the stars with Drosselmeyer's help, for the clockmaker was also an expert in astrology. He drew up the princess's horoscope. Oh my. This was a Herculean task, as the astral lines kept tangling with each other, but at last, hurrah, it was clear. In order to break the spell that had made her so ugly, and thus regain her former beauty, Princess Pirlipat had to nibble on the kernel of the sweet nut Krakatuk. Now, Krakatuk had such a hard shell that you could have fired a 48-pound cannonball at it without cracking it in the slightest. Nonetheless, for the spell to be broken, this hard nut would have to be broken between the teeth of a man who had never shaved and who had never worn boots. Furthermore, he would have to do it in front of the princess. He would have to hand the kernel to her himself, and then take 7 steps backwards without stumbling, with his eyes closed. Of course. For 3 days and 3 nights, Drosselmeyer and the astrologer worked without stopping. On Saturday, the king was sitting at his noonday meal when Drosselmeyer, who was to be beheaded early Sunday morning, burst in full joy and jubilation to explain the means by which he could restore the perfect beauty of Princess Pirlipat. The king embraced him in a flood of rapture and promised him a diamond sword, 4 medals, and 2 new Sunday suits. Right after dinner, the monarch declared kindly, "You must get back to work. And be careful, dear clockmaker, for the young unshaven man in shoes with the nut Krakatuk is close at hand. Also, be sure that he drinks no wine before he comes. I don't want him to trip up when, crab-like, he has to take 7 backward steps. He can get completely pickled afterwards, of course." Drosselmeyer was dismayed at this speech by the king. He stammered with considerable trembling that the cure had only just been discovered. He still had to look both for the nut Krakatuk and for the young gentleman who was to crack it. Indeed, there was some doubt as to whether they could be found at all. The king, enraged, whirled his scepter about his crowned head and roared like a lion. "All right, then, off with your head." It was lucky for poor, anxious Drosselmeyer that the king had very much liked his meals that day, and so was in a generous mood. Thus he was willing to listen to the queen, who made a very practical plea on the clockmaker's behalf. Drosselmeyer took courage from this plea and explained that he really had done the job assigned to him, to find the means to heal the princess, and thus he thought he had won the right to live. At first the king called this argument pure nonsense and empty chatter, but finally, after he'd had a dose of digestive medicine to soothe his stomach, he declared that the clockmaker and the astrologer should search ceaselessly until they had found the nut Krakatuk. As for the man who was to crack the nut, the queen suggested that he could be located through advertisements placed in newspapers both at home and abroad. Godfather Drosselmeyer interrupted this story at this point, but promised to finish it on the following evening, which is what we are going to do as well. We will finish this tomorrow. Have a wonderful night, you guys. See you then.